Or fishing on these phones. Good morning. Go get a cup of coffee. What are you hanging with now? Hanging with the herd? It sounds like something that sportscaster puts out. Colin Coward, he calls it the herd. You know about that? Hey everybody, in Hale Center, shut off your microphones. Tahoka's participating in that conversation.
Sorry about that. We'll turn our mic off.
No, that's not you. That's Hale Center, I think. Well, it suddenly got quiet anyway, so maybe it's Tahoka.
No, it's not Hale Center.
It's not Hale Center. You're innocent. Okay. Must have been Tahoka. It's really hard sometimes. Next generation may be different, but up until your generation, you always sat and looked at that little box and you watched it, and now it's watching you. That gets a little bit freaky. Well, you're a couple minutes early and I don't have my coffee. I'll be back. It's on here. Are you guys out there seeing my students, or are you seeing me?
Students.
Students. Hey, you guys are all movie stars now. Let me see if I can fix it. I know you'd probably look at them than me, but there you go. Now you're private again, guys. You can put your feet back on the table and it's really funny because a few years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, I think it was Smyer, and they didn't think that people could see them. And there were 3 or 4 girls that were sitting there with their feet up on their desktops. And somehow their principal got notice of it and became upset. Wasn't me, I didn't rat them out. But other people can see you sometimes. For example, the technician at the region can see you because he has to regulate the quality of the system. So sometimes he'll notice things. If you're not on that camera, it's not likely that he can see you. Okay. All right. We left off, according to my fine recording, talking about Plymouth. We hadn't talked about Massachusetts Bay. And the thing I have on the slide right here kind of summarizes some of the things about Plymouth. Yes, ma'am? I'm waiting for it to come up, yeah. The government call themselves the General Court, and remember that in these groups, the only voting people, they call themselves freemen. I'm not sure what they were free from, but freemen. And the only ones that could vote were the believers. And they called themselves the saints, and the other people were along because they could do things, but they were called the strangers. They had no votes. They didn't sign the Mayflower Compact or anything like that. It was only the believers that signed. Some of the things that they went through, they're self-governing. In fact, all the charter companies, either back home or when they get there, select who's going to be the governor or the head man. Usually they called him a governor. And then they had kind of a little council or a representative group or whatever you call it. Not very many people, so it wasn't very large. And they also had to be believers, also had to be saints. Some of the things they went through that we'll talk about in a while when we get to talking about the indigenous people in more detail were some of the wars. There were 2 wars in between colonists and the Indians, even their good friends, the Wampanoags, eventually, as pressure on Indian land got greater and greater. The last of those wars was King Philip's War, and up until the American Civil War, maybe even longer than that, if you're talking proportionately, King Philip's War killed off more of the overall population than any war did. It was pretty nasty. Also, part of that gradual process that we'll talk about is that all of the Indian tribal groups up there in New England, one after the other, they kind of disappear or they're shoved out of there and they go other places. And eventually Plymouth's going to be absorbed by the next colony that we're going to talk about, and that's Massachusetts Bay Colony. There's that map I had up. I think we ended with that map. That kind of summarizes it. People were very much aware of what was going on in Virginia. Maybe not the truth, but they thought they were aware of what was going on in Virginia. And they were aware of the Plymouth colony. And about mid-1620s, people started thinking about, let's do another one. Once again, some of them were people that wanted to get away from the church, but a whole lot of them, and particularly their backers, were people that wanted to make some money on the deal. And the thing that they had in that area of New England was fish. So early investors were interested in that, in salted fish brought back from that place. I don't think they got much money out of their investment. This colony was also chartered by Charles I. James I had died in 1625, and his son Charles I. If James I was the wisest fool in all of Christendom, Charles I was probably a little bit more of a fool than James. He thought, as a lot of people who inherit everything they've got from daddy and probably didn't have to work for it very hard, he thought that he was kind of authorized to be king by heaven or something like that, and he started behaving that way more and more. For example, Parliament, which was pretty powerful in England as opposed to in other parts of Europe, they were responsible for the king's pocketbooks. And sometimes Charles would just send Parliament home until he needed money, then he'd call him back in and say, okay, quick, pass a bill and get me some money. And sometimes he had problems with that, and eventually he's going to push the issue too hard and he's going to be shortened by one head. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that place in history. These guys were also Puritans. They tended to be Calvinists, but they weren't people that were convinced they had to split with the Church of England. They wanted to improve the Church of England or kind of change it a little bit. Let's look at some of the principal characters. They're going to head up in an area north of where the Plymouth colony is. If you look at this map, don't worry about all the lines and labels. If you look at this map, I guess you can see where the pointer's pointing. There's Plymouth, and up north of there will be Massachusetts Bay Colony. And of course, they're claiming or controlling a lot of territory north of them. And eventually the king, one of the kings is going to have to intervene and settle all of that. First thing they do before they go to colonize, they have to form some kind of a company to do it, and they form a new company called the New England Company. It'll be the Puritans on one side, and it'll be merchants who are looking for money on the other side get together to form this. And they build something in England called the Council of New England. Don't worry about a lot of the names of the things in England, but what's happening is all through the time that they colonized, they kept trying to refine it. So one time you hear that the chief of the Royal Treasury is in charge of it, the next time it's the chief of trade, and maybe the chief of all English affairs in one region of the world. It keeps changing. So we just call it the English government or whatever. In England, the Executive Council of England, the king didn't run everything on a day-to-day basis. The Executive Council was called the Privy Council. And all these other councils kind of come under their authority. A few of them actually aren't under the authority of the Privy Council, but most are. The name on the bottom of that page, in case you can't see it, is John Winthrop. John Winthrop was a lawyer and a minister. That's a really dangerous combination. He was one of these Puritans that wanted to set up this colony, and he and his co-believers all thought that what they should do is go somewhere where they can kind of start with a clean slate and show everybody else in the church, this is how we should do it. And he preached that even on the ship on the way over. I can imagine being stuck in a little boat and having to listen to him all day long. But he preached, and he quoted out of the Bible about we shall be as a city on a hill. Can't remember what the whole thing was. It was, I think it came from the Sermon of the Mount in the Christian Bible. My years of learning all of that long past. I can remember being tortured every Sunday having to recite things from the Bible. under pain of great family disgrace and everything else. John Winthrop is a big guy. I mean, he was one of the important names early on. These people, first of all, there are going to be more of them. Second of all, because the Plymouth colony is already established, people know more about how to do it. They will bring along specialists and things that they call the strangers. And once again, I don't know what the separation is, how many saints and how many strangers in this particular group. But this group, larger, probably a little bit more contentious, a little bit less united. They hadn't traveled all over Europe to escape the church or any of that. They hadn't been through those hardships. So when they arrived, they more or less had a government organized, and they hadn't been there for 2 years when they started arguing about things like taxes and that sort of thing, which is a more kind of a modern, social issue. They didn't just argue about taxes either. They argued about their own religion. They argued about whether the guy next door was following the religion as well as you were. They had a lot of issues of that nature. But basically, they stuck together and survived. I was digging through here trying to get the quote. "For we must consider that we shall be as a city on a hill, the eyes of all the people who are on us." What he's telling them is that the whole world's watching this. And the bottom line is, we better succeed, because if we won't, the whole world will see us fail. He also does something strange, and I'm not sure, perhaps you all have, at some time in your life, had a friend who did this when you were playing a game you were just learning, like Monopoly or something like that, where your friend had the rule book, and he kind of said what the rules were as you went along. Well, John Winthrop got hold of the charter. It's supposed to stay in the office in London, but he got hold of it, brought it with him. And whenever there's a dispute, he would refer to the charter that he had, that nobody else had, and nobody else could see. I'm surprised he lived very long, but he was a pretty good politician and a lawyer. And on and off he will be governor. Sometimes he's voted out, and then he'll be back in again. Very influential man. I talked about some of the arguments that they had early on. 1630 is when they got there. 1632 they have their first big brouhaha about taxes. And you can imagine these people, I mean, what are they paying their taxes with? They don't have any money, so it's with food or whatever they can produce. And some people are very resentful that it seems like the people in the high end of the general court are getting all of this, and what are they doing with it? And they're saying, oh, of course, we're spending it to protect you, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this debate. But that wasn't the only issue. There was another issue, and that had to do with the indigenous people, with the Indians, and that was because pretty quickly these people started expanding. Now their numbers are going to grow. I mean, Plymouth grew fairly quickly. Massachusetts colony will have, within about 10 or 15 years, they'll have 80,000 people there. So we're not talking about something like Virginia that took almost 50 years to get 1,500 people. We're talking about a large number of people. They live in kind of family villages all over the area. They're not always the family village, but what I'm getting at, they're small groups of people, probably really know each other well, probably intermarry and what have you. They educate their children. Usually it's kind of through the church that the children are educated. When children grow up, if they want to be freemen and be voters and things of that nature, they all have to go through this experience, have some kind of a in the head or in the heart experience, which makes them really believe their religion. They have to express this. They have to stand up and tell people about it. before they kind of graduate into adulthood and also into what they called sainthood. Eventually, young people are going to get a little tired of that and stop wanting to jump through hoops to participate in the colony, and that's a subject for another day. There was a minister by the name of Roger Williams. This place was minister heavy. They had, every other man was a minister. That's just because of the nature of what they were doing when they were in England before they came over. One of them was Roger Williams, and Roger Williams was upset because it seemed like they were pushing the Indians around, and first of all, probably not a good idea just in terms of security, and second of all, we're supposed to be believers and believe in this certain way, and we're not acting that way when we treat the Indians. We're taking land away from them, we're not paying them for anything, we're taking away their places where they grow crops and all that. And that's just not right. That was one of his complaints. He had another complaint. He said, we're supposed to be this Puritans wanting to purify the Church of England, and we seem to be drifting away a little bit from our original arguments. And he wasn't comfortable with that. And finally he said, and for heaven's sakes, we left England because of laws that forced you to go to church and penalized you if you didn't. So why are we doing the same thing here? If you don't go to church, you're in trouble. He didn't like that either. And he complained enough and he spoke out enough and he was listened to enough that he upset the leaders of the colony. And they told him to zip his lip, they told him to shut up, and he didn't, so they banished him. Now if you think about the significance of that, nowadays, Mr. Hunt got banished from South Plains College, he'd go fishing. I mean, big deal, you know. What if you got banished from a colony when there was no other colony anywhere around? That's like a death sentence. It's like a death sentence. And in the case of Roger Williams, they banished him, and okay, now what am I going to do? Well, because he argued on behalf of the Indians, a group of Narragansett Indians came to him and said, never mind, friend Roger, we'll take you into a nicer place. You don't have to live with these people. And they did. They took him down to a place that we call, don't know what they called it then, we call it Narragansett Bay. On this map, let's see if I can find it for you. All these maps seem to concentrate on Connecticut, but over on the far right, where you see the letters R-I, oh, we lost it. Come back. Over on the far right there, that's Narragansett Bay. I think the arrow is pointing at it. I think you can see it. And he's going to set up his own colony there. And eventually he'll apply for a patent or for a charter. And that will become the colony of Rhode Island and the Providence Plantations. Later on they just hacked the end of that name off. And it became the colony of Rhode Island. When I was a little boy, I always thought, Rhode Island, it must be an island, where is it? I was really disappointed when I found out it was on the continent. In his colony, tolerance is one of the requirements. So you're not pushing people around about their religion, and anyone's welcome as long as they behave. Other people got run out of Massachusetts colony too, on more or less religious grounds. There was a problem. Let's see if I've got the word here on the slide. Maybe I went by it. There it is. There's old Roger Williams' name. We'll skip the lady in between for just a minute. We'll look at that word down below. It's antinomianism, and I don't profess to be an expert on this, but these people believed that, contrary to what Puritans believed and most Christians believed, that the Bible was the final word, they believed that there could be other revelations and words after the Bible. They believed that people could get divine inspiration that went beyond the Bible. And they also believed, I think, a little bit the way the Anabaptists believed, that you shouldn't be baptized until you were old enough to understand what it meant. Of course, the Catholics and most of the Calvinists and people like that thought you should be baptized at birth, and still do. But this was a movement inside the church, and it was called heresy, and people that believed in antinomianism were driven out of the church many places, not just in the Americas. In this case, though, in the case of Massachusetts Bay, you're going to get a couple of people. I'm trying to find some names for you. The reason they're significant is because they found their own colonies when they're driven out, just like Roger Williams did. Let's go back and look at that map. There was a fellow named Thomas Hooker. He went further to the inland from where Roger Williams was and set up a colony which will eventually be part of Connecticut, over near the Connecticut River. There was another fellow named John Wheelwright. He's going to go north, up until where New Hampshire is now. And he will found a colony up there called Exeter. It will eventually be part of New Hampshire. We don't talk about, we always talk about the original 13 colonies. There were many, many more than 13 colonies. Why we end up with 13 colonies when we're talking about the American Revolution is these colonies grew together. For example, Massachusetts Bay Colony will absorb Plymouth Colony. They will also claim colonies up into what is now Maine, and there'll be arguments over that in the coming years. At any rate, we should mention the Dutch, because a little bit south and a little bit west of Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth, the Dutch claimed a great big hunk of land. Who did that? Can anybody remember? It was an Englishman that actually did it for them. Anybody remember what his name was? What I'm flashing up on the screen is the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company, which will be successively be in charge of this colony initially. And there it is. Who was the guy that explored along the coast of Long Island and up the Hudson River and all that? That's a hint right there. No, it wasn't Adrian Block. What's the name of the river? Hello? Hudson River, yes. We're awake, aren't we? Yeah. Okay. Hudson River, yeah. Henry Hudson did that. And they're going to claim a whole area that they call the New Netherlands. Just for your personal knowledge, the Netherlands and Holland are synonymous. The people that we call the Dutch people call themselves Nederlanders. They do not call themselves Dutch, because Dutch sounds like Deutsch, and Deutsch means German. And especially after the Second World War, the Dutch don't necessarily like the Germans. I had a Dutch girl persuade me of that with a right hand to the jaw when I said something I thought was funny about Adolf Hitler, and she smacked my face and said, "We don't say that name in our house." I learned better. She was bigger than me, too. So. I was a little 13-year-old kid. This is a 19-year-old girl that was living with us. I was running around the house all the time with my little tongue hanging out, my prepubescent tongue, like that, following this beautiful girl around. Let's talk about our first proprietary colony. Remember, we had three kinds, right? We had charter colony, proprietary, and royal colonies. By this time, by 1624, Virginia has shifted from being a charter colony to a royal colony. In the case of Maryland, a fellow by the name of George Calvert, who had served the crown, but he's a Catholic, thought that he would like to take advantage of the new settlements in the Americas to make a refuge for Catholics over there. And so he'll get a charter. Now the difference between, and I'll say this over and over again, the difference between a charter colony and a proprietary colony is a charter colony was somewhere in between this latitude and that latitude. And it really didn't have any boundaries east and west, except the eastern boundary would have to at least be the Atlantic. And in theory, the western boundary could go as far as you could imagine. A proprietary colony always had, it was always a box. It always had borders to it. Sometimes there were arguments about where the borders were. In the case of Maryland, it's going to cover a lot of territory, and that will shrink down, but it's mainly at the northern end of the Chesapeake Bay. It borders Pennsylvania and Virginia, and eventually Delaware. But that will kind of happen later. George Calvert applies for this charter. He gets it. He pays the crown for this land, which I find interesting, since who gave the land to the crown to start with? But you can argue that all your life. At any rate, he buys this land to set it up as a refuge for Catholics. I don't think the population of that colony will ever be a majority of Catholics. And every once in a while, the people in the colony, the Protestants in the colony, will get tired of being pushed around by George Calvert. Well, George didn't go there. His son Cecil went there. And there'll be kind of rumblings in the colony, maybe even kind of a little revolution or something, and they're trying to kick the Calverts out. But usually the crown supported the Calverts' proprietorship. So initially, at least, they have tolerance of religions. In fact, in the 1649, I think, they pass a law favoring tolerance. This is after one of those little revolutions where Cecil Calvert's little group gets kicked out and they have to fight their way back in. And then they pass a law for tolerance. That's an interesting reaction to being, someone kind of slapping you in the face and pushing you around as you go back and say, now we're going to tolerate one another. Usually you would think, someone would want revenge or something. Funny thing, that act of tolerance is going to be reviewed by Parliament in England, and Parliament's going to say that's illegal. But about 25 years down the line, Parliament's going to pass an act of tolerance. Go figure, things change. Way in the future, Maryland was in the 30s, started up in 1632 officially. First city was a place called St. Mary's City. It's still there, not much of it, not much to it, and it's going to grow. By the way, I should say, the title that George and Cecil Calvert had successively was Lord Baltimore. That gives you a hint where the name of that city came from. I bet he didn't know they were going to have a football team. Next colonies I want to point out are the Carolinas, and it was one colony at the beginning. And we'll go back and we'll talk about things going on in England. When we get done naming the colonies like this, I'll go back and we'll look at events that were going on in England that affected all of this. But in 1660, King Charles II was restored to the throne. His family had been kicked off the throne for about 10 years. And when they came back, he wanted to reward the guys in Parliament that supported his point of view. And he picked out these 9 gentlemen he thought really contributed to his welfare, and he gave them this charter for this colony. And they were called the 9 Lords Proprietor. And they're going to set up this colony, and some people with fairly bright minds are going to try and make this a more planned out colony. Because now there's already colonies in New England, Virginia's growing, so now people think they know how to do it better. One of the people who will be involved in this, you write his name down, you might even want to etch it into your hand. His name was John Locke, L-O-C-K-E. Among other things, John Locke was a political philosopher. And John Locke is going to write some things that are almost totally plagiarized and added to our Declaration of Independence and principles that are put forth in our Constitution. So he's important to us. He was one of the planners of this colony. They planned, actually, the first city was going to be Charlestown, obviously named after His Majesty, and the Carolina Colony, of course, Carolina Colony, that's a version of Charles as well. The next colony is up north. Remember the New Netherlands that we were talking about? They had the island of Manhattan, all those islands around what is now New York City, the southern tip of Long Island and inland. And the Dutch had colonies all the way up the Hudson River, up the Connecticut River, or on the west side of the Connecticut River. They're always rubbing noses with the English colonists to their north. And the British and the Dutch are always in commercial competition. And I mentioned in your readings the Navigation Acts. And the Navigation Acts were the acts that enforced Britain's or England's closed system of trade, their mercantile system. And the problem was that the Dutch did a lot of transportation of goods to England, and suddenly when they passed the Navigation Act, that made it illegal. It shut the Dutch out. And there are going to be a series of wars between the English and the Dutch over this and similar issues. In the Second Anglo-Dutch War, right at the beginning of the war, the English are going to come over to New Netherlands and grab it. The New Netherlands don't have a navy or an army or anything like that, so there's not much they can do about it, and they now become part of the English colony. And they're going to name it after the younger brother of King Charles II, James, the Duke of York. You never guess what the name of this place will be. And they changed New Amsterdam City, which Amsterdam is a large city in Holland. They changed the name from New Amsterdam to New York as well. So the state's called New York, the capital city's called New York. New York's actually a large state. We tend to focus on New York City, and New York goes all the way up to the Great Lakes. It's a pretty large state. At any rate, that happens in, let me get the date here. Where's New York? Hello, New York. Trying to find a map. The maps kind of include a lot of different places. There's New York on that map. And that will happen, let's see, the Second Anglo-Dutch War. That will happen in 1664. Along the way, though, and this is the map for it, there's another individual who has a lot of money, Admiral Sir William Penn, whose son has joined a new religious group who are a little bit different from the Church of England, in fact, quite a bit different from the Church of England. And they are named based on what their church service looks like, because when they get the feeling and they feel that they're touched by the Word, they start to move about. and they're called the Quakers. And that's why they're called the Quakers. They call themselves, I think, the Friends. But they were uncomfortable in England, just like the Puritans had been. Not quite as uncomfortable as the Puritans, because time has passed. Things have become a little bit milder. And Sir William Penn had lent the Crown a lot of money. And so the Penn family told the Crown, we will forgive the debt if you'll give us that land. And they're given land. It's just below New York. I don't know if I have the latitude and longitude, but it's the same thing as Maryland in as much as it's a proprietary colony and it's got definite boundaries. One corner of it kind of touches on the Great Lakes. New York's to the north and east. New Jersey's to the east. That will come along later and we won't even talk about it. Delaware to the south. That also alters things for Maryland and Pennsylvania. The Penn family will run this place, but it'll be run by a committee of the Friends. And of all the colonies, this is probably the most diverse because they'll allow anyone to come there as long as they're law-abiding, productive people. And it's insisted they get along with the Indians. So, of all the colonies, they probably did the best with the Indians. Until you get up to the time of the French and Indian War, then people are forced to take sides a little bit. And different people get in control of Pennsylvania. But they have everybody from Spanish Jews, all different religions. And they tolerate them all. More tolerant. They're tolerant along the lines of what Lord Baltimore wanted to do, but he couldn't get it done all the way. Down in Maryland. The last colony, which will become a royal province eventually, they'll all become provinces, is Georgia, and that's not going to happen until 1732. That's way down the line when you've got, 1732, I think that's George II. And he's going to charter this colony. One of the reasons for chartering it is that to the south of them, they have the Spanish, and they're concerned with the Spanish creeping up towards the Carolinas, and they want to block that off. It's set up with a council called trustees. It's a trusteeship. There's 21 trustees, and they make some interesting rules. There will be no slaves in this colony. There will be no hard alcohol in this colony. No one will amass big collections of land. We're not going to have families like the Byrds and the Randolphs and all that they have in Virginia that own most of the good land. No one can have more than 50 acres. Now, a lot of those things broke down pretty quickly. Some of the English people that came to Georgia came from the Bahamas. They already had slaves. They brought them with them. And there are also plenty of people that like demon rum, so that's going to make its way in there too eventually. But they planned to do some interesting things. They planned to grow mulberry trees. Anybody know anything about mulberry trees out there in Never Never Land? You're agronomists and all that. Anybody know about them in this room? What's neat about a mulberry tree? Why would you want to grow a mulberry tree? It grows in a lot of different climates. It's got nice berries on it. If you try and pick them in your hands and they squish, then your hands are permanently purple. At least you can't wash it off real fast. Something eats the leaves of the mulberry trees. What eats the leaves of the mulberry trees? Nobody out there? Hale Center, somebody? What eats mulberry leaves? Look at him going for Google. Silkworms. They decided they wanted to try raising silkworms and manufacturing silk, and it didn't work. They're a little bit different from some of the more northern colonies. The Carolinas will split. Trying to see when they split in 1712. So by the time that Georgia's founded, they've already split. Carolinas did a combination of things. In the very far southern part, you could probably grow sugar. The rest of it, they grew tobacco and things kind of similar to Virginia. Georgia, on the other hand, being the furthest south, being right next door to Spanish territory, they're going to do a little bit of agriculture, but not that much. They're going to do sugar. They're going to sell timber, play around with trying to grow rice with some success. And they're also, because they're way down south and nobody's looking, they're going to sneak over to the Caribbean and do business with the Spanish islands over there, buying sugar and things of that nature. That's not to say that the other colonies weren't already doing that. Remember, this is supposed to be a closed system of trade enforced by the Navigation Act, but even up in Boston, also in Philadelphia, every once in a while a ship would sneak down to the Caribbean and buy sugar. And if you didn't buy sugar, you bought the liquid sugar product. What's that? People used to put it on their pancakes, but then they got maple syrup. Molasses. Little kids used to put molasses on their bread when they were eating. People used to take sulfur and mix it with molasses to try and make it taste good, and that was a commonly used medicine. Nothing can make sulfur taste good. But there's a more important thing commercially that molasses does for you. What can you make out of molasses? They're all innocent young people, so they don't know. Okay, let me put it a different way, a different hint. What fueled the Royal Navy?
Make syrup.
Yeah, you make syrup. What did the Royal Navy run on? What was the most important thing to the Royal Navy? Living in the Royal Navy was miserable, living on a warship. What did they give all their sailors? $1 of it a day. And it wasn't sulfur and molasses either. Still don't know? It rhymes with dumb. Rum. Rum. Rum was really valuable because you've got the British Navy. Wherever the British Navy is, you've got buyers. They'll buy it by the barrel load. And people like John Hancock were slipping that into Boston. People were slipping it into Pennsylvania. Not because everybody needed rum, although in the colonies, rum was a good winter drink, hot buttered rum. It's kind of funny, they mixed different things in it, and then they took a red hot poker out of the fireplace and just stuck it in the mug to heat it. I don't think anyone does it that way anymore, but it is still consumed. So that was one of the other things they did. They had a lot of interchange with the islands down in the Caribbean. Because they were next to Spanish territory during different wars, and we're going to talk about those wars, the Spanish often attacked across the border, or even better, as far as the Spanish were concerned, they paid Indians to go across the border and attack. Not to say that the Georgians didn't also pay Indians to go across the border and attack the Spanish, to be fair. Okay. In fact, there's the most famous governor. He was the governor from 1732 until 1743, and he will organize, oops, you don't see his picture, sorry guys. He will organize defenses against the Spanish successfully. He was kind of a strict governor, and so a lot of the people didn't like him very much, but at least he fought off the Spanish repeatedly. Where does that take us? Let's talk about the indigenous people. Somebody out there in Never Never Land doesn't know what indigenous means. They're the people that were already living there when you get there. It's all relative, right? Because they came from somewhere too, but it's like the Native Americans, that sort of thing. Down in the South, in Virginia, we know that the colonists met with the Powhatan Confederacy, and it was a a love-hate thing. Sometimes they got along, sometimes they fought. There were two wars called the Powhatan Wars. The Powhatans were led by Wahun Seneca, who Walt Disney turned into Powhatan. They taught the English early on how to grow some food. Wahun Seneca actually allowed his daughter to be baptized and marry an Englishman. There's your Pocahontas love story. But some of them hated the Europeans, like Opequano, and he launched a war after his father or older cousin or whatever the relationship, we're not sure what it was. After Wahun Seneca died, he launched a war in 1622, killed 350 colonists, and their population was only about 14 or 1500, so that's a major portion of the colony. In the following year, the colonists poisoned about 200 Indians just to get even. So, yeah. Sometimes wars are stupid. Almost all the time, in fact. You can look at the slide about the Powhatans, but they were on the decline even before the settlers got there. Whether they had got diseases that were passed up from Spanish territory or what, I don't know. Tobacco probably caused most of the arguments because it caused the colonies to spread out. The southern colonies were always very rural. That's the range of the Powhatans when the settlers got there, all the brown area. Up north, the first tribe you hear about is the Wampanoags, who greeted the Plymouth colony settlers. We talked about Squanto and Massasoit. Squanto actually wasn't a Wampanoag, but he was living with them because his tribe had died out. Very important. Massasoit and Governor Bradford kept a lid on conflicts between the Indians and the colonists for quite a while. When they died,
your conference is scheduled to end in 2
We'll
minutes.
talk about the Indian Wars next time. There's Squanto. Lots of other tribes, Abenaki, Pequot. There'll be Pequot Wars, Mohicans, all of them, almost all of them, Algonquian speakers up there. Okay. Tune in next time, and we'll finish these colonies off. We'll talk about the Indians a little bit, we'll talk about slavery a little bit, and then we'll move into foreign influences. We'll find out what's going on in England while these guys are all out there in the colony, far, far away. Have a wonderful day.
Your conference is now over. Goodbye.